Okay, so last class period, we talked about some of the other nonviolent protests that were taking place. Montgomery bus boycott is where we ended last class. So trying to end segregation on buses in Montgomery. And so the success of the Montgomery bus boycott is going to spur even more nonviolent protests. So one of those protests is Little Rock 9. And it's not even I don't know if I would call this a protest, because this is just like doing something that was given to you as a right. Like just trying to go to school. Like that's not a protest, like you're just going to school. However, think back, last class where we talked about Brown v. Board of Education, and Brown v. Board of Education overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and ended segregation in schools. They said we can no longer have segregated schools. We have to start integrating. However, many people are going to be hesitant about that integration, especially in places like the South, in Little Rock, Arkansas. So the Little Rock 9 is based off of the 9 African American students that were tried to be integrated into Little Rock, Arkansas, or Little Rock High School. However, the governor of Arkansas, Orval Faubus, he is going to use the National Guard. They're going to come in and they're going to bar the doors from entry, denying entry to those 9 African American students. They're going to use the National Guard. They're going to lock up the front doors, barring the first day of school. However, Eisenhower is going to hear about this. Eisenhower is going to hear about the abuse of power that Orval Faubus is using in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he's going to send in his own troops, over 1,000 troops President Eisenhower is going to send in to try to walk these students safely to and from school every day for over a year. He tries to walk them to and from school. And on the outside, like to get into school, they are safely led into school, nothing happens. However, once they're inside the building, I think I mentioned last class period how inside the building, the children who attended the school with them, pushed one of the students down a flight of stairs. One of them threw acid in another girl's face. And so even with the troops being sent in to safely escort these people to and from school every day, they were still met with violence inside a building that you come to school every day and you expect to be safe in. You don't expect to be hurt or anything unexpected to happen. It's supposed to be a safe environment for you guys to come to school in. So he eventually has to allow the 9 African American students to safely integrate into the school. However, after a year, there you go. I missed that one. After a year of integration, he's going to come in, he's going to shut down all schools, all public schools. He's going to shut them down. The rationale that he uses is for the safety of African Americans. The safety of African Americans. It wasn't safe for African Americans to go to public school. That was his justification. Not a good justification, because eventually the courts are going to come out and they're going to say, not a good enough reason to segregate, not a good enough reason to keep students from not going to school, from, again, trying to stop integration, not a good enough reason. So the courts are eventually going to overturn his standing. They're going to open public schools back up. But one of the biggest things to understand here is that people start to realize that maybe just using the court system, maybe just relying on the court system isn't going to be enough. If we solely based our movement in the civil rights movement based off of having the Supreme Court or having the federal courts specifically decide on every single little thing that happened, piece of segregation, piece of racism that happened, change would be very slow. And so there was a group of people who said that we have to rely on the court system. And then there's going to be another group of people who think the courts aren't going to be it. The courts are not going to be the only thing to get things done. We have to have action. We have to have movement in our fight for equality. And so groups are going to start popping up. We talked about the NAACP, created clear back in the early 1900s. This is another group, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was established in 1957. The SCLC, Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the presidents up until his assassination. He's one of the first presidents of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then he'll be assassinated a couple years later. But the SCLC is again trying to start putting action into what they've done, into what they want to get done, And so starting to plan sit-in movements, starting to plan boycotts, starting to plan marches, trying to be active in the community, trying to get their voices heard across the United States and not just in one section of the country, across the United States. So groups start to pop up. We're going to talk about CORE. We're going to talk about SNCC. So a bunch of different organizations, student organizations, specifically college students and their active part in the civil rights movement. So thinking about some of the other things that's also going on during this time period, okay? What else is happening in the 1960s? So keep in mind, space race, absolutely. Keep in mind that we are still going through like the Red Scare. We're still going through the Cold War. The Cold War lasts for over like 45 years. Like this is still all taking place. Along with this fight for equality in the United States, we are still fighting the Cold War. So some of those events that are taking place in the Cold War realm of things, you have 1960, JFK is going to be elected as president. So Eisenhower, before Eisenhower leaves office, him and the CIA. So think back, the CIA, we talked about the creation of the CIA last unit and how they were big on trying to like overthrow communist, non-democratic regimes across the United States. And we're going to see this in Cuba. And so Eisenhower, before he leaves office, him and the CIA, they get together and they plan on how to overthrow Fidel Castro. So Fidel Castro was the leader in Cuba, communist sort of based, communist led. Originally, he actually came in and he overthrew, like with military force, he overthrew the American-backed leader before Fidel Castro, Batista. So he overthrew the American-backed leader. He came into power. And so we're starting to have like these tensions between Cuba and the United States. And keep in mind, like this goes clear back to the Spanish-American War. Like we talked about the Spanish-American War after, like before World War II, very, very first semester, we talked about the Spanish-American War. Cuba comes in, they're trying to fight for their independence against Spain. However, after that ends, like keep in mind, the United States still has like their hand well into Cuba. Right? At this time, like in the 1950s, 1960s, at this time, a lot of like the sugar plantations in Cuba are American owned. A lot of like the cattle plantation, like the cattle farms in Cuba, American owned. And so we have like a lot of like the rich American plantation owners have their hands in the economy in Cuba. And Fidel Castro, he takes over in power and realizes that this is not what he wants for Cuba. He does not want this sort of this American interference in Cuba. And so he is going to start to look at other countries, dividing their attention away from the United States. And during this time period, when you have a deeply divided world, the United States versus the Soviet Union, communism versus democracy, they start to look at the Soviet Union, especially after the failed overthrow of Fidel Castro. And so I want you guys to get into Schoology real quick. We're going to pause our notes. We'll come back to these. I want you guys to get into Schoology. Oh, did I not?